What's up, YouTube? So today I want to talk about a really cool technique for creating generative granular ambiences and atmospheric loops. So this idea is kind of loosely inspired by Brian Eno. I guess one of the techniques that he has outlined before is using little bits of musical pieces and kind of stringing them together to create a bigger musical piece. On one hand, this is kind of loosely inspired by that, but also on the other hand, kind of loosely inspired by just randomization in general. So this is a really cool technique for creating a much more compelling and interesting piece of music with an instrument that maybe you're not too good at playing with. So the idea is you record in a couple of loops and you throw that into the granular, create something like this, and you're good to go from there. This technique generally works well with instruments that are kind of tonal, like stuff like a wooden flute or like a handpan, where the notes kind of always work together because you can kind of mishmash anything. And because it's kind of, it's a tuned instrument, it's going to kind of always sound good, if that makes sense. And it's more about sequencing the little pieces of music to create one bigger arrangement, right? So for this example, I'm using this tiny little tongue drum, kind of similar to a handpan, obviously not as cool, but we can actually get really similar sounds by just kind of pitch shifting it into a lower octave, right? So yeah, let's play around a little bit with that today. So firstly, we have 3 oscillators in Serum, right? And if we want to load 3 sort of granular things in, we can think of an interesting way in which we can sort of record to make the most of that, right? So my usual idea with this kind of workflow is to record 3 bits of music in varying complexities, varying tonal complexities. So the first one will generally just be like octaves, like the root note and an octave, or root note and some harmonics, right? Then the second one will be maybe like major notes, right? Or like a fifth, perfect fifths and that kind of thing. And then the third piece of music will be all of the notes within a scale or something like that. So this allows you to blend those 3 granular oscillators to kind of get more complex as you go, right? So yeah, let's just quickly record in a couple of loops with this. So usually I'll run these things through Isotope RX because there's a really cool spectral denoise system here. But you don't necessarily need this. I'm sure there's various kind of free gate plugins and that kind of thing. And you don't necessarily need to denoise it. You can kind of get some room noise and stuff to make it kind of sound a bit organic if you want. But I find when, really layering things and that kind of thing, it really helps to kind of get as clean of a sound as possible at the source. Because then as you layer things, it doesn't get noisier and noisier. Do you know what I mean? So let's just quickly learn the noise profile here. And then we can apply it to the entire sample. And I'm going to do that for all 3 samples that we just created. Sometimes Isotope RX actually reveals a little bit of information that like maybe we missed or something like that in the initial recording. So obviously like my headphones don't play frequencies down that low. And you can see there's a little bit of a low frequency thud that came through with the microphone, right? As we kind of at the transient. So we may consider removing that with an EQ as well. And again, just doing it inside Isotope RX is super, super clean. But again, you don't necessarily need that. You can use an EQ in your DAW. But I got the software on a really good deal at Black Friday, so I'm going to use it. So usually you can tell here if you see some movement happening below the fundamental. So usually you can see where the fundamental of the tone is. It's like the most brightest harmonic is usually the fundamental. The lowest brightest harmonic, okay? If there's some stuff happening below that, it's probably an issue in the recording process or something. You may want to leave it in again if you want a kind of more organic, less processed sound or something like that. But I tend to use the EQ here, go to high pass, set this to brick wall, and then we can actually just go like this and see whereabouts that low fundamental is. It's above 300, so we should be good just doing something like a cut like that, and then maybe doing another less drastic cut just slightly higher, 400. Let's apply the EQ to all of these samples. So then what I'll do is I'll usually just go in and actually fine tune it a little bit. So for example, we don't need this beginning part, any silences and stuff we can kind of remove and kind of just overlap like that, and then let's just crossfade like this. And then let's select them all, consolidate, bounce in place. Now we can open Serum 2 and we can drop that sample in and hover and drop it on a granular. Okay, so what I want to do now is I quickly just want to set this up, and then what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate it and then drop the other samples in, because that's about the easiest way to do it rather than setting up the granular how you want to do it like for each one, right? So here what I'll usually do is I'll set this to manual mode. And so now it's just going to loop like where we drop the playhead in the initial sample. I usually set the length, right click to BPM sync, and then the density to BPM sync as well, because what this allows us to do is kind of create like a loop. And now we can go in here and we can actually use this exponential to create like a decay-like shape. So we get the transient nice and clean. So now if we just modulate this position, we can get some kind of tonal variations. We can actually set this offset, so it's going to randomly generate us a new position each time. Give it a random pan, random direction, so some will be backwards. Okay, we're getting somewhere now. We may want to choose something that's not quite, let's maybe do the hand and then just skew it like this. So there's a little bit of an attack. Just so we don't get a click, let's go like -99. That's cool. Okay, so what I'll usually do is I won't randomize the offset here. I will set up a macro to do this, and then I'll use the same macro for all of the oscillators so that we can kind of scrub the position all together, right? And then the reason I do it with a macro is because now we can assign either an LFO or we can assign a MIDI controller, like however we want to do it, but the setup is still there, right? Okay, so once we've got this in place, we can actually right-click here and say copy with mods, and then paste. And then we can just set up the position modulation how we want to. Remove modulators, position. Okay, so the trick now is we actually want to turn this level down on this granular, and then we're going to set up another macro to kind of like do a three-way mix between, to kind of crossfade between three different oscillators. And I will show you how to set that up in one moment. So here, what we can do is we can actually just quickly clean up this sample and then load it in. We can right-click, we can say normalize. Okay, so then let's copy, paste, and then we can set up this position modulation here. Okay, so for now, let's just check if these are working by turning the level up. Cool, and let's load up the last sample here. Okay, so once we have all three, in fact here we can normalize. Once we have all three samples loaded up, now what we can do is we can work on the crossfade system to crossfade between the three sources. So what we want to do is we want to just drop this macro onto all of these. In fact, we can rename this one to position and this one to crossfade. And so here we want to right click here, edit custom curve. And with this one, we want to go from 100% to the middle and then like this kind of pattern, right? And then here we can set up a thing that's like from 0 to 100% then back down to 0. And then with this one, we can set up the inverse of that first one. And so now what's going to happen is it should set up a system where we can crossfade between these. You see here we have this one. You can actually vaguely see it with that blue dot. In the middle we have this oscillator. And then on the far side we have this oscillator. Okay, so the real magic comes when we randomize these. So you can set up MIDI and actually play it like kind of like an instrument or like tape loops and that kind of thing. But the real magic, in my opinion, comes in just like setting these up to something like chaos. And then the X and the Y can be modulations for these two positions. And now it'll kind of always be in sync, but it'll generate us kind of like random little melodies that'll hopefully not be the same. It'll kind of keep being generative. Do you know what I mean? And in fact, some of them we can set like different parameters. So for example, this one we can have quicker notes. We can have one of them that's kind of not tied to a grain size. So let's set this to free. And then we can also randomize this with one of these parameters, right? Let's put some effects on here. Maybe just like EQ to remove some of that like lower mid-range. It's a little bit boxy. 1/8 dotted ping pong could be cool. Some reverb. I should probably also mention that let me just pop open another. This was actually made aware by somebody in the comments on my first Granular Serum 2 video. So props, whoever you are. Sorry, I can't remember the username. But if you name your sounds, for example, like C4 at the end or A3, it'll automatically tune it to the specific frequency. So in that example, when we render these out, we actually want to call it like A4, A5, because then it's going to tune it accordingly, right? So here, let's actually go into the folder here, and then here we can actually just rename these And then I'm actually going to copy and paste these straight into the Serum directory. So let's go File or Menu, Open Serum folder. And then we can say Samples, User. And then if you just drop them here, now when we load them, because we've named it with the root note at the end there, it will automatically pitch it correctly. So we can actually remove these. And now we can reopen this. It's strange, it's still loaded into memory, even though technically this file doesn't exist anymore. So let's try user, tongue drum 1, tongue drum 2, tongue drum 3. Oh yeah, these we need to normalize again. So now it should automatically pitch it. So it should be chromatic to whatever we play. So for example, we can now play it in F if we wanted to make it work with a track that we're writing in F. So here's another example of basically the same thing, but with a flute sound instead. I really love this because it allows you to kind of just experiment and make noise, and then from the noise you kind of piece together a kind of more sensible, slightly larger piece of music, and then you kind of use that as like a loop or a sample to then get inspired to create a more complex piece of music. So it's kind of like the whole process just starts with play, and you just experiment and fine tune, and eventually it gets to the point where it's like, wow, it actually sounds so organic, and like there's somebody, you know, chilling next to the river playing that flute or whatever the case is. But I mean, I love to set up these patches because then I can just kind of sit back and listen, and the moment I kind of hear something cool, I just record a chunk of that out, and now that becomes the new cherry pie or mud pie or idea jam or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I think that about sums it up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to upload that tongue drum preset to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So if you want to know what that's all about, check out the link in the description. And thanks again for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you guys next time. One last thing, don't forget the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. Yeah, okay, thanks guys, cheers.